Bungie was back this week with some latest news from Destiny 2 related to Season 14, including details when it's going to be available for players, plus news of the world's first race. We've also got in-depth news of weapon buffs, including 450 auto rifles, linear fusion rifles and fusions, plus some buffs to perks across the sandbox. Well, if you're new around here or find this useful, don't forget to hit that subscribe button down below for all the latest Destiny 2 content and turn on notifications by hitting that bell. Well, let's dive into the news taken from this week at Bungie on the 29th of April 2021. So Bungie say, in case you haven't already heard, Vault of Glass is coming to Destiny 2 for the first time next season. Now, though we haven't revealed the season of Redacted yet, and we should see a little bit more on that next week, we want to make sure you've got time to make any arrangements necessary if you're planning on taking the challenge of getting a Vault of Glass raid clear on day one. So the Vault of Glass is going to go live on May the 22nd at 10 AM PDT. So that is right, Guardians are going to be going up against Atheon in less than a month, and the story isn't changing, but you may notice some other differences. So our goal was to keep the feeling similar to how you remember, but we made some updates to bring this content up to Destiny 2 standards. We don't want to spoil anything though, and you'll experience it for yourself starting May the 22nd. Well, next up, we got details of the World First Race. So World's First Races have been exciting events over the last 7 years since, well, we first kicked things off with Vault of Glass back in 2014. So back then, no one really knew what to expect from this highly challenging cooperative activity. There was a mystery and excitement in the air that set the stage for all future races to come. And with this being the first raid returning from the Destiny Content Vault, we asked ourselves, how do we recapture or reimagine that moment? So our goal is to not fundamentally evolve this raid into something completely new. So this will be the first race outside of the previous hard modes where players have a broad understanding of what to expect while still encountering changes they'll have to adapt to. With that in mind, we're shaking things up with a new type of World's First Race. So Vault of Glass will launch with a contest mode enabled for 24 hours. And you're going to need to be at 1300 power to be at the cap for all encounters. And clearing Vault of Glass with contest mode active is the first step to access the new challenge mode in the Director and the Tempo's Edge Triumph. So completing Tempo's Edge, a curated list of triumphs in this newly unlocked challenge mode, will be how a fire team crosses the world first finish line and claims their prize. And to enforce the triumph's requirements in the challenge mode, your team will wipe if you fail the success conditions during each encounter. So what prize, you may ask? Well, we decided to bring a belt for the occasion. Wanted to respect the Guardians who were the first to be victorious in the Vault nearly 7 years ago. So these belts will have a silver aesthetic and will have the clan name of the OG World First Fire team featured. And that is a nice touch given a team has already beaten the Vault of Glass. So challenge mode and the Tempo's Edge Triumph will only be available for the first 24 hours, and then that node will disappear. And the encounter challenges will become available again later in the season. We've got a full array of raid rewards and Bungie rewards associated with the Vault of Glass, as well as an emblem available for completing it. And we're going to cover all of the details on how to get them soon. So one quick thing to call out is the opening area of Vault of Glass will now be in a private space for your fire team, so don't expect any backup from wandering Guardians. You won't be able to abandon the mission and explore Venus, as tempting as that is, and there's only going to be one way forward, and that is into the Vault. And as with any World First Race, we'll be following along and keeping an eye on the action as it unfolds. Well, that is a little bit about the Vault of Glass, but next up we're going to have a look at the Sandbox balancing. So a few weeks ago, talked about the upcoming changes that are coming to the Sandbox. So we started by looking at a few weapon types that are a little hot and needed some cooling down. So today we're focusing on some upcoming buffs coming next season. And we've got designer Chris Proctor here, who wants to share thoughts about weapon roles and heavy weapons in particular. So we intend each weapon to excel in one or two areas, making them optimal choices in particular situations based on target type or engagement distance. So for heavy weapons, this is how we intend weapons to fulfill the roles of ad clear, single target damage and burst damage too. So we do have an explanation of each of the roles here. So first up we've got ad clear, so clearing weaker enemies faster than you could normally with primary ammo weapon. For most content, primaries do the ad clear job perfectly well, and this is most useful in high difficult PvE, such as Grandmaster Nightfalls, where you sometimes benefit from the rapid fire damage of a machine gun, or the group clearing potential of a rocket launcher. We've also got single target damage, so burning down a boss, and burst damage, so burning down a champion quickly, or for bosses with multiple damage phases, or finally clearing a phase quickly. So next up, let's have a look at how weapons map to roles. So first of all, we've got sword, so ammo efficient add clear, single target sustained damage and secondary burst damage at the cost of being next to a dangerous target. With rocket launcher, you've got burst damage and secondary add clear. Machine gun, they've got ammo efficient add clear and secondary single target sustained damage. And Bungie say they do expect to adjust machine guns later in a future season, as they're not really currently hitting that target. We've got linear fusion rifles, so single target sustained damage where the target has a handy crit spot, or secondary burst damage. We've got drum grenade launchers, so burst add clear, secondary single target damage. And finally exotic snipers, so single target sustained damage where the target has a handy crit spot. So a few examples of how we've used heavy weapons in playtest and high difficulty content, or when we play Grandmaster Nightfalls in retail. So linear fusion rifles, you burn down champions, boss damage where the boss has a crit spot, or with divinity. So with rocket launchers, you've got burst damage against champions or bosses, particularly with lasting impression, clearing clumped up waves of tough adds. And finally machine gun, so breaking matching shields and GMs where other weapons can't do the trick, using machine gun instead of a primary weapon in a heavy ammo rich situation where your primary and secondary weapons are not rapid fire, e.g. Le Monarch, Succession, or whatever machine gun has a useful damage type in the GM. So next up, Bungie go on to talk about their balancing philosophy. So there's two approaches that we take in balancing weapon changes. So big swings, i.e. making a big change that we believe will immediately encourage new player behaviour, and this is most useful when we need to nerf or buff something hard enough that everyone can tell that it's happened, with the expectation that we may need to dial the tuning down in a later release. And a good example of that is 120 handgunners buff in Beyond Light, or the rocket launcher buff in Season of the Chosen. Then they talk about incremental change, so you take something that we feel isn't far from where it needs to be and nudge it a little at a time. So this is most useful when we don't want to overcorrect something or make something overpowered, or when we want to make a change with a huge test wake and would prefer smaller, safer changes. So for example, precision auto rifle change outlined below, or the Season of Arrival's high impact pulse rifle change. So in most releases we make changes of both types, and which we choose for a given feature depends on how much time we have to test or iterate on a change, how many changes are already in a release, and how close we think a feature is to being balanced already. So with that in mind, let's have a look at these sandbox changes. So we're going to have a look at the weapon archetypes first, and first of all we've got precision 450 RPM auto rifles. So this subfamily fell behind other auto rifles in the auto rifle tuning last year, so damage has been increased to be closer to the time to kill of others, so increased precision 450 RPM auto rifle damage per bullet from 17 to 18. So next up we've got rare weapons, so we added a rare machine gun and bow to the world loot pool recently, but we didn't add any obtainable linear fusion rifles or breach grenade launchers, and wanted to make sure these archetypes were easily accessible. So added an existing blue unobtainable rare linear fusion rifle and breach grenade launcher to the world loot pool. So next up we've got a big one, it's the linear fusion rifle buff. So these are unpopular choices in PvE, largely because other weapons do their intended job, so single target sustained damage, or more efficiently without requirement of landing all precision hits. So we want to keep the LFR focus on precision damage, but decided to increase the precision damage to make it more competitive and increase reserves to give them more staying power. Note that we have seen plenty of suggestions to move some of the LFRs out of the heavy slot, but this is a substantial amount of work and a balance risk for PvP due to the difficulty of balancing sniper rifles as insta-shot weapons against LFRs with charge time, with wildly varying flinch and aim assist values, and reduces weapon diversity in the heavy slot. So it is still possible for some time in the future though, if tuning them as heavy weapons doesn't have the desired effect. So they're going to increase the precision damage by 15% and increase the reserve ammo by 20%. So we're getting a buff to damage and a buff to ammo reserves. Next up we've got fusion rifles. So the recent buff to fusion rifle ranges had the side effects of making the best subfamily for PvP high impact even better. So we've decided to bring the low range stat fusion rifles up a fair bit. So increasing the damage fall off start distance for fusion rifles, no effect on 100 range stat, so it's plus 2 meter on 0 range stats. So that is good news. Hopefully the low range stat fusion rifles will be much more viable. Well, that is the weapon buffs. Next up, let's have a look at the perks. So first of all, we got Subsistence. So when we made this perk, we're experimenting with the unusual downsides for powerful perks, but ultimately decided that reducing reserves wasn't an interesting trade-off. We also want to be able to put the perk on special and heavy weapons, where reducing reserves would feel terrible. So submachine guns were granted a much smaller magazine fraction than auto rifles, so we fixed that at the same time. So no longer reduces reserve ammunition, and submachine guns now receive the same ammo fraction per takedown that auto rifles do. So it was 10% like most weapons, and now it's 17%, the same as auto rifles. We got high impact reserves and under pressure. Due to technical constraints at the time these were created, the trigger condition for these is on projectile impact, i.e. the bonus won't take effect until you fire the weapon once, but we've had more flexibility in the perk activators now, so these are now active as long as their conditions are met. Next up we got Unrelenting, so this one was hard to trigger in difficult content, and the health awarded was hard to perceive. Now it's easier to trigger in PvE, so you get immediate trigger on mages and heals 20% more. Next up we got Sympathetic Arsenal, so this one isn't appealing for many players as it is, but it's useful in niche situations, so we decided to add a small buff to sweeten it a little, so now it grants plus 20 reload in addition to its primary effect. Next up we got Dragonfly, so it's always bugged us that Dragonfly wouldn't proc on every enemy you could finish with a precision hit, so now it works on heavy shanks and servitors and occurs faster than it did in the Season of the Chosen fix. So next up we've got Iron Grip, Iron Gaze and Iron Reach, so we were cautious when making stat bump perks in Season Arrivals, not wanting to break weapon stat ranges at too low of a cost, but the penalties these ship with were too much, and now that we've seen them out there in the wilds, so we have reduced the stat penalty from -40 to -30. Next up we got Osmosis and Elemental Capacitor, so we didn't have time to address this when Stasis came to being. We always wanted them to work correctly with a Stasis subclass, so Osmosis now switches the weapon to Stasis damage when playing a Stasis subclass, and this should work for any mechanic that asks for Stasis damage, but not for the Stasis ability. Next up we got No Distractions, so because of an exotic change below and the sniper rifle flinch changes in Season of the Chosen, wanted to make No Distractions more appealing option for combating flinch, so reduced trigger time from 1.5 seconds to 1 second and increased flinch reduction from 30% to 35%. Well, next up we got mods, so we got Adept Mag and Adept Targeting, so same reasoning as the Iron Banner perk. We were cautious initially, but we think it's fine to reduce the penalties for these perks, having seen them in action, so reduce secondary stat penalty from -20 to -15 and fixed Adept Mag not granting reserves when applied to a sword. And we got Adept Counterbalance, so this one didn't feel like an upgrade over standard counterbalance stock to be worthwhile and increase the recoil direction benefit. So we've got a few exotic tuning changes, so we've got Mida Multi-Tool. We've seen many requests to switch this from Outlaw to something more useful, and one thing we've observed in Mida is losing fights to weapons that cause more flinch, so here we go. So change the Catalyst perk from Outlaw to No Distractions, so that one should be a nice little fix for Mida Multi-Tool. And next up we got Hawk Moon, so increase the priority of Paracausal Charge and Paracausal Shot buff text, and this sometimes was dropping off the bottom of the list. So we do have some changes for the future, so sometime further into Season 14 we expect to touch the following. So we've got all shotguns, so we don't expect to change the 2 dominant shotguns, replacing Quick Draw with Surplus and nerfing Quick Draw to really move the needle on shotgun usage overall in PvP. You know, we agree with some of the comments that the weapon use is not only dependent on the tuning, but the map design is also a factor. However, we want more weapons to be viable on all maps, and we can achieve this through tuning, giving other special weapons room to excel. So specifics on that are coming a bit later on. We got Dead Man's Tale, so with the upcoming nerf to 120 hand cannon range, we expect to see a surge in Dead Man's Tale usage, which, to be honest, is already high. So we've had enough moving pieces in Season 14 that we didn't want to squeeze this in at the same time. We also have a change ready to go that reigns in its ability to challenge sniper rifles, 120 hand cannons and scout rifles while in hipfire without detracting from the fantasy of the weapon. We got fusion rifle changes too, so as with some of the other changes, we don't want to bump these too much too fast, so a follow-up is going to be needed. So there's plenty of changes there to get excited about. Linear fusion rifles could be viable for once, and I do think it's worth picking up linear fusion rifles in prep for Season 14. But let me know down in the comments what you think of the changes, and let me know if you're going to be jumping into the Vault of Glass on May the 22nd. Well, that is it for this look at the latest Destiny 2 news. And as always, thank you so much for watching. For more Destiny 2 content like this, hit that subscribe button down below and subscribe to This Week in Video Games. If you want to join the community, check out the Discord link in the description, or you can follow me on Twitter at TWIVG Podcast. If you enjoyed this video and found it useful, liking and sharing the video would really help me out. Otherwise, check out the other videos on the channel. Thanks again. See you in the next video.